Hello, good afternoon. My name's Ben. I'm one of the co-curators of the festival this year. And welcome to this conversation and screening, Affective Proximities, a genealogy of queer media tactics, followed by a screening of Media as Process by Alex Martinez-Rowe and Alexandra Juhasz. I'm delighted to welcome Cait McKinney and David Isaac Hecht here in person, and to Alex Martinez-Rowe, who joins us live from Australia. On stage. So, after their incredible keynote talk for the festival at the Canadian Embassy earlier this week, we're delighted to welcome Cait back to Hackavay and the festival weekend. Cait McKinney is an associate professor in the School of Communication at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver, Canada, on the ancestral and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. They specialize in sexuality studies, media history, and activist media. Their research focuses on the mediated conditions in which queer people, especially activists, have taken up new computing and information technologies to serve their communities and movements. This work surfaces queer modes of technological use that shows alternative ways of understanding technologies and their politics, and offers new media theories and methodologies that emerge from and can account for the knowledges of queer people. David Isaac Hecht is Director of Facilities for the Prime Produce Apprentice Cooperative, co-steward of the Cybernetics Library in New York, and is Research Design Build Coordinator for Seeds to Soil. He teaches at the New School and was a 2024 Processing Foundation Fellow. He works with communities to achieve visions through design, fabrication, and relational practices. Alex Martinez-Rowe is an artist researching genealogies of feminist political practices of difference through film installation, publications, and dialogic events. She is the author of Two Become Two, Propositions for Feminist Collective Practice, and was awarded the Future of Europe Art Prize in 2018. She is a senior lecturer in art at the Victorian College of the Arts. As I say, Alex joins us today from Naarm or Melbourne. Dr. Alexandra Juhasz, who co-made the film with Alex Martinez-Rowe, is Distinguished Professor of Film at Brooklyn College. She makes and studies committed media practices that contribute to political change and individual and community growth. Today's conversation brings David, Cait, and Alex together under the title Affective Proximities, a genealogy of queer media tactics. The session will interrogate the interplay between tactics and strategy in relation to digital forms of queer activism from the 1980s AIDS crisis up to the present day. The conversation will trace how tactics animated by early forms of digital technology such as home video, email attachments, and early database systems have become reanimated through today's network system. This includes the lasting tactics such as the blackout, a tactic that began with Visual AIDS Day Without Art, 1995 to 2000, which Cait talked about in their keynote at the McLuhan lecture earlier this week. Through the use of this and other examples, the conversation will explore how the adoption of digital tactics has been applied by diverse queer communities to achieve strategic goals that enact meaningful social change. Finally, the conversation will be followed by a screening of Alex Martinez-Rowe and Alexandra Juhasz's new film, Media as Process. The film navigates the archives of Alexandra Juhasz to uncover feminist media methods developed within the NYC community video movement in the 90s. Juhasz's methods look to collectively address how women were affected by AIDS and to construct histories of queer feminist media activism. Please join me in welcoming Alex, Cait, and David.
Oh, there we are.
Okay.
All right.
Hi, Alex.
Hi, Alex.
Hi, Cait. Hi, David.
It's a bit strange for our panel on affective proximities that we're looking at you and hearing you in two monitors, but we'll get through it.
Yeah.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. So we thought what we would do is treat this as a way to set up some of the themes in Alex's film for the screening at the end of the session. And we wanted to approach that by talking about how each of our own practices relate to the question of how media can facilitate political relationships across time and space. And I think it might make sense, Alex, if you want to kick us off with talking about your practice in this project in relation to that question.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Cait. Thanks, David. And I also want to thank Ben and Elise for the invitation to contribute to the panel. And I also want to begin by acknowledging that I'm on Bunurong and Wurundjeri country, Naarm in Melbourne. And I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Sovereignty was never ceded. So I wanted to contribute 3 initial ideas to this question of how media can facilitate political relationships across time and space. I don't know if can I get the first slide that I sent the text? Yeah, great. So the video that we'll screen in this session, Media as Process, is one of my collaborations with Alex Juhasz, and it presents the feminist media methods that Alex and her collaborators developed in the community video movement in the 90s in New York City. And community video became a way for activists to disseminate information that wasn't otherwise available, but it was also a way to create the relational bonds that sustain a political movement. Wait, I'm just going to take out these earphones because I hear myself. So the relational format of making videos of collective political process electrifies the encounter and gives purpose to being together through a common project. And so as Alex says, I love this, press record as an excuse. So this is the first idea that I want to contribute, that the end product is just as or less important than the way collectively making videos performatively brings about political relationships by making them public and creating publics for them. So like consciousness raising, collaborative activist media constructs a political space, often for those who haven't had one before. So the next idea, collaborative activist media making is a propeller for relationships that operate autonomously from conventional relationships under capitalism in family, work, and consumer culture. So it does that through foregrounding the interstitial moments, the unspectacular and yet profound embodied exchange that occurs in conversation. Moments like these in the process are rarely considered in the collection and format of official archives. So this is the second idea I want to contribute, that queer activist media often foregrounds how relationships are the most fundamental political practice, which all other political action depends on. You can't get people to strike unless there are bonds of trust that enable people to take that risk together. So video recordings of collective action transmit the embodied relationality of political practice to those in other times and places. And in our video, as an example, Media as Process, I wanted to focus on the way that the relationship between Alex Juhasz and another AIDS activist, Juanita Mohammed Shapansky, can I get the second slide, had stood out to me in Alex's archive as a co-becoming of selves over decades. A commitment to each other and a relationship of entrustment, or affidamento, as the Milan Women's Bookstore Cooperative named this kind of relationship in the 80s. So where two people, starting from their differences, commit to each other and work together as political partners, using the differing accesses to political space that they have and their different competences to support each other's desires. So Alex's long-term relationships with her political partners are foregrounded in her archive, in the media that they made together, through the way that they made it, the way that they archived it, distributed it, and continue to revisit it. And the third idea I want to contribute is that activist media archives offer an opportunity to be in close relation to those who've come before us or live far from us, and create the possibility of forming kinships with those that we've not met in person. Being able to access recordings and materials from other times and places creates continuity and alliances among social movements, strengthening their international and intergenerational connections. Can I get the next slide? Media's Process, the film that we're going to screen, is part of a larger series called Storytelling Liberation. And another of the films is a collaboration with Archive ASCII in Athens, which is the leading archive of the Greek left. And it's called Collective Biography. And the film documents 40 history students from 4 different European countries collectively creating public history podcasts about the lives of female resistance fighters in World War II and after. Can I get the next slide? And I witnessed, for me, it was profound. I witnessed how their encounter with the documents of these women's lives gave these young people such a profound sense of their own political purpose in these troubled times. They formed a true kinship with these anti-fascist women through their archival traces. Liberation politics depends on the empowerment of its participants, and there's nothing so compelling as having a genealogy, a culture to inherit, knowing that similar activism in the past has effectively taken place by means accessible to yourself in the present. So they were the 3 ideas I wanted to put out first to kick off the discussion. Not sure how you guys want to take that.
I can, yeah.
Go for it.
Great. Thanks, Alex. So, I mean, the way I want to take up the question of your film, having personally watched it already and knowing also Alex Juhasz's work for a long time in the space of queer community video and AIDS activism, I wanted to talk about how those themes align with my own research, which is based in queer media history and works a lot with similar kinds of archives and themes. Ben already set this up in his intro, but in my work, I'm interested in historicizing computing and the internet through the work of queer activists. So the overall goals of my work are to queer our histories and understandings of technologies and their social dimensions and implications. And the methods I draw on in my work are often and primarily archival, so working with a lot of kind of records, often paper records, but also interviews with activists, which involves a lot of intergenerational work and collaboration. And I think the theme you brought up of entrustment is very important there. And also more recently, I'm working on a collaborative project with a former sysop of a very big queer website from the 90s, which I'll talk about a bit more in a moment. And so similarly, that work involves a lot of relationship building and trust building, which I think is important if we want to be able to sort of carefully and respectfully surface these histories of alternative uses and appropriations of media technologies. A lot of my work, in other words, involves working with archives and also activists to try and produce and recover feelings of closeness to what work with computing and internet technologies was like. And often we have like quite poor records of these moments and practices. I think you're wearing an Internet Archive hat, David, and I think there's often a perception that's a very sort of fulsome record of what the web was like in the 90s, and it's great, and I use it all the time, the Internet Archive's Wayback Machine. But just so much is actually missing because it wasn't scraped at all, or wasn't scraped at the right time, or it occurred before 1996. And so I've been thinking a lot lately in the methods of my work of like, what do we do about those sort of holes and absences? The project I'm working on right now is a book called The Sex Lives of Data. And the McLuhan lecture I gave a few evenings ago was one of the chapters from that book called A Queer History of Blackouts. And it's about how the blackout as an online protest tactic is fundamentally grounded in HIV/AIDS activism. And if we understand that grounding in HIV/AIDS and its sort of cultures of responding to and mapping and representing structures of harm, then we can better understand like what it is that tactic is doing now when it's applied to other kinds of political issues, like, for example, climate change. The blackout is a critique of structural violence, and that ability for it to make that critique is partly about how it emerges out of AIDS work, is the argument I made in the talk. But the book overall is trying to surface how queer modes of desire, of connection, of relation, which is a lovely concept you've introduced to us, Alex, are fundamental to understanding what computing and the internet were for many kinds of users and what they could have become but didn't for all kinds of reasons related to things like capitalism. And the chapter that I am working on now is a history of a website called leatherdyke.com. So I'm collaborating with Elaine Miller, who's a friend of mine who's also based in Vancouver. And she was the founder and co-systems operator of leatherdyke.com, which was an extremely popular queer women's SM kink site from the mid-1990s through the early 2000s. And so Elaine hand-coded and built this website herself. She was a sort of self-described hardcore computer nerd. She taught herself MySQL and a bunch of programming languages. And this site was basically an example of non-commercial social media. So it was private and password protected. You had to be a member, and everyone was vetted if they wanted to have a profile and join the site. And it was a place for queer women in the Pacific Northwest to gather and kind of share information and images and information about parties and talk about their lives and what it meant to be a leatherdyke. And so the site really, I find this really interesting if you're into the metal of these kinds of questions of media history. But as Elaine describes it, when MySQL, which is a relational database software that's still the backbone of a lot of the internet, but in the 90s was the backbone of every website. When it went from version 4 to version 5, it basically became too hard for most amateurs to use and maintain. And the site just kind of fell apart and broke down. So she has it all on hard drives, but part of the work we're doing is working with the digital humanities lab at the library at my university to, from her hard drives, rebuild a static version of the site so that she can archive it. So I won't see that archived version of the site because it's private and it's not for me, but it will allow her to create that version, work with community archives where she wants to donate it so that in 50 years it's accessible to researchers and people who are interested in queer history. And then in addition to that digital humanities work we're doing together, I'm also working with Elaine doing kind of oral histories and interviews of this site and why they designed it the way that they did. And the idea we're working with together is what is the leatherdyke philosophy of technology? And how does that philosophy of technology impact the model for this early non-commercial social media site? And if we think with that particular technological philosophy, which comes out of work like people like Gail Rubin and Susan Stryker, who are thinking about technology and kink and queerness at that time. But if we think with them, what might social media have become, or what could it have been if MySQL, for example, continued to be accessible to amateurs? And these records are often absent from queer histories. As I mentioned before. So this, I think, recovery work is another example of the kind of care and stewardship that's really at the core, Alex, of your project, and that I think is so crucial to doing this kind of work. Yeah, and I would love to hear from you, David, about how you see these themes coming up in your work with the Cybernetics Library.
Yeah, thank you. Gosh, I'm so grateful to be here with the two of you, and the work you're doing is far ahead of, I think, what I do in importance, or at least accessibility. Although with the library, we're trying to open it up. Really quick, I should mention, Ben in my bio mentioned that I'm part of a cooperative and that I do a thing called Seeds to Soil, but these are really fundamental parts of what I'm doing in that I'm part of communities and we work together, we build through what he mentioned as, I think of as relational practices. We're trying to create space for people who are pursuing some form of justice, some form of agency, building ways of working together. And Alex writes really beautifully about some other examples of this in her book, which I brought and highly recommend. So I just wanted to mention Prime Produce and Seeds to Soil are these projects that consume my daily life, and the cybernetics library lives inside of the cooperative building that I'm part of managing. And those relational practices that both of you mentioned is something that the cybernetics library, despite its name, I like to say we're not true believers in cybernetics. I met those folks, they're great. I've learned from them, but we question that. And part of what we're questioning is similar to what you just mentioned, Cait. The gaps and failed futures that have emerged, or not emerged, rather, in the history of technology and society. We're very interested in that. And we're interested in both feedback loops that help us understand our position in relation to systems that constitute us, and then also that we're constituting. And a great deal of that is, you can read it through the standard history of technology and society, but also it can be read in what's left out, or read in imaginaries and practices and discourses that are seemingly far from that. So the library is a pretty queer institution. We have a lot of documentation, some of which relates to things Cait is studying. We have party flyers from 90s leather shows in New York, and we have a cybernetics of sex collection. We also have collections that range into, especially relevant in the US now and forever, questions of race. We have a pretty sizable collection we call the Abolitionist Futures collection that was made in support of a nonprofit that lives at my co-op, who work with formerly incarcerated communities, and they're trying to build community and power through tech education. So the library as an archive is trying to be a resource that communities can access. And the picture that Alex put up in the slide of people gathered around a book or a zine, that's like moments we strive for, where people find something in the archive that ranges. I mean, we have really old stuff, but some of what's germane to what we're talking about is 60s, 70s, weird old computer stuff, or radical literature from 1968. And I think, Alex, you were, let me see what I wrote down. There was a really nice, the lineages, the sort of looking at that intergenerational practice and realizing, and this is very true for climate work, and some of the people we support are very active in that. There are documents from the 60s and 70s that are stating the problems that we're facing now in completely clear and contemporary terms. Nothing's changed in terms of the problem set. And when people find that, I think it's both shocking that certain things have not changed and that we haven't found leverage to make systemic change happen, but also there's the notion that we're not alone or doing something for the first time, that there is a lineage and a set of knowledge and methods and approaches and community building tactics and thoughts about how to leverage, and this is getting to our question, some of these documents have strategies for leveraging media as an activist tool. And so there's this beautiful publication called Radical Software that we have copies of, in which portable video is available for the first time in the 70s, and they talk about how communities can grasp that technology and advocate for themselves by making videos and hijacking cable TV. So that, to me, really connected with what Alex is working on, and I was so thrilled to see the video, and I'm excited that, oh, and one other thing, I'll just wave these things around. We have a really extensive zine collection, and zines are an amazing piece of media that communities produce themselves. They're static, but they can be archived, and they can be very easily shared. And so I think that comes in the mix, too, of how the media travel, but more on that later.
I thought I'd just throw in.
I kind of wanted to toss it to you, Alex, because where I was headed with that was that sort of I love that idea of the lineages and the genealogies, and I wonder what was coming up for you.
Oh, I was going to say something else, but I can link it to that, I'm sure, which is that I think that correspondence is a really interesting figure to kind of bring in to think about what's the difference between a kind of commercial and a community use of media. And I always think back to Dana Goodman's incredible books on the Enlightenment salons, and how in the early modern Republic of Letters, people would meet in the salons. They would, get to know each other, have these fabulous conversations in person, and then they would go away and they would write each other letters for months at a time. They might not see each other for quite some time. And often when they got a letter they thought was really special, they would enclose that in another letter to be sent on to somebody else. And I always think of that figure as like, isn't that kind of what someone like Alex Juhasz has been doing for so many decades with her constant publishing the process? She's, she's kind of using media to propel and keep going the encounters that also happen in person. And I feel like that's what's happening with the cybernetics library too in your projects, David, that people kind of come together, and then the publishing, or that's a way of keeping it going and involving new people who otherwise wouldn't be part of it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just so interested in how the concept of relationality has been at the core of what you've both been saying so far today. So Alex, you talked about the idea of entrustment, which I think comes out of your interest in Italian feminist theories and histories. And David, you talked about that I'm really interested in this queer moment of going to the library and encountering a kind of past in which you can see yourself, and you describe that in a really lovely way. So I guess what I'd like to ask Alex is if you can tell us a little bit, spill the tea a little bit about how you got to know other Alex, Juhasz, and the process of this film, because only David and I have seen it, but your relationship is so, I think, the core of this film. We see see the two of you in dialogue so much in it, and it's very clear that the work is possible because of a prior process that we're not necessarily privy to as an audience.
Well, Alex read my book and then got in touch with me, and we had a conversation, and it was wonderful, and I just felt an immediate, I guess I think she's listening, but I'm not sure I've ever met anyone who's so like me. So it was kind of really strange how we just sort of saw ourselves as twins in a way, from different generations, different international contexts, but we kind of approach things in the same way. And so when I see her archive, these community video projects that she did with AIDS activists, I think it's so similar to how I go about making things. And with this project, Storytelling Liberation, that I was working on, I pretty soon thought, I should really involve Alex in that. And I've been really interested in that project, in how we have to be international in this moment. We are facing such enormous terrors and dangers all around us, and the only way that we can fight that is through leveraging capacity and possibilities in one place to help another. And so being international is essential for any kind of good future that we hope for. And yet I am, more and more constrained with travel, and I think that will just become more like that for all of us, not just financial reasons, although that's a big one, but coming from Australia, but it's also about care responsibilities. It's about physical ability. It's about climate change and natural disasters, preventing travel. It's about all sorts of different access issues that make travel less available to me and to many people I know than it was 10, 15 years ago. And so I really wanted to try out the idea of making a film that did build a real relationship, but to do so remotely. And this is where I also think that making the film I've never actually met Alex in person, but we've built this this project and others through using online video conferencing and email and these technologies which open up that possibility for us. And I find I love the cheapness of the medium, the fact that it's accessible and we can kind of do whatever we want. We could make films, we can publish, we can do it's very it feels very enabling to think about making films with people in other places with no means. And so that's why that's why we ended up making this film as part of the series.
Well, and I love, Cait, that you brought it to that relationality, and that so everyone will see it in the film. I think the relationships that you cover are not going to spoil it, but like there's a lot about relationships in the film, and I feel like something I'm looking forward to seeing how people experience is how those relationships are mediated, but in a way that's empowering or enabling. There's a moment in the film where media becomes the topic of conversation, and for me, that's like one of these standout moments where you see both the role of media and the role of relationships like cycling, and there's sort of a fractal thing where also you and Alex have a moment like that, which is really fun. And I think you mentioned it when we were talking, and like there's several, that letter in the letter thing is really cool. And I think how people gain access to those sort of reciprocal, relational, like the things that strengthen those relationships, like that's something I really hope we find ways to do more, especially across the distance you're just indicating. Like we're very far from some of the most dire situations. Some of us are, some are very close, but like how we gain, like I'm thinking a lot about how distant, except through imagery, some of the things happening in the world feel. So I don't know, I'm sitting a lot with that stuff that you're talking about and how hard it is to form a relationship or find a way to provide leverage from a distance.
And I think that's coming about because of I think we have to have the genealogy. We have to be able to kind of, people need access to that. And that's what I love so much about your project, Cait, the Blackouts project, the fact that you're linking these actions in the present to ones that have come before. I mean, I'm not sure how many people who are using those strategies now are aware of that genealogy, but I wonder, your project is going to have an effect on the way that people use these strategies now that they have access to understanding its history. And I wonder if you could tell us a bit about your aims with that, or how you feel raising the awareness will make a difference to the way that these tactics are taken up.
Yeah, I mean, I think something that I've learned from doing this kind of work, this kind of research, is that at no point in time do queer activists or artists make their work in order to be historical, right? And like people are often wary when I approach them of their work being sort of framed that way, as being like of or in the past, which is not at all the goals of what I want to do. So people don't make their work to be historical, but they make their work always to affect change in their present, which is about trying to achieve a vision of the world, right? And it might be, in the more specific case we're talking about, a vision of a world without AIDS. It might be a vision of a world that is not on the constant precipice of climate disaster. It could be any number of things, a world without prisons, what have you. But there's always this kind of future orientation. But it's not about being historical. It's about a kind of otherwiseness or an opening. And I think what I find so, as a history nerd, what I find so compelling always about this kind of work is like thinking about how it connects with urgencies in our present. You've already brought this up, Alex, when you talked about how we, desperately need a kind of internationalism or like renewed globalism in our current moment, because so many of the far-right movements that we're seeing organized so very well right now are specifically about to organized anti-globalism. And so there are models from the past that we can look to for those things, like DeForest Brown Jr.'s work at the festival over the last couple of days, for example, has been very much about talking about sort of the history of these Black globalisms and what they can tell us about politics in the present. And that's just one example. There's many people doing this kind of work.
Yeah, this brings up something really strongly for me about what could it mean to have like a queering of archival practice? But I think the answer is right here. It's like archival practice is something present and activating that like lends itself to action, lends itself to like communities being empowered by building on memory, by building on experience, by making those things last in the face of erasure, which is such a technique of power right now. And, like I'm thinking from what you said, a world without genocide, like, is that possible if erasure is one of the big tactics of these kind of oppressions? So I really resonate with what you're saying.
I think, the reason it's so powerful is because when we choose to inherit a genealogy like the one that you've written about, Cait, it provides a kind of it is a common world, to kind of reference Hannah Arendt, this idea of a commons, something that can't be bought or sold. It's a kind of transgenerational gift that gets given in a way, and I think that's where I feel like a lot of the archival work is so much about storytelling. It's so much about knowing those stories, and it's precisely stories which are, they're like becoming endangered in a way, because big tech is trying to sell us these fake stories. The Instagram story, that's not a real story. That's a fake story. That's, they're trying to sell that because we need those bonds. We need what storytelling gives us as a process of transmission that gives us our common world, our sense of who we are. And I think it's actually really important to start talking about what is a real story, real storytelling, and as a gesture towards protecting and reviving traditional practices that, traditional in whatever sense you want to think about, but just non-commercial, I guess, to differentiate them from this commercialization of stories, and to honor the importance that, inheriting a culture has for, how can you go about participating in an activist movement if you aren't sure whether it's going to go anywhere, and so having that history is what gives you the resolve to keep going.
So it's almost time to turn to your film, which this is the world premiere, right?
Yeah.
Right, yes, okay, great, which is very exciting. Is there anything else that you wanted to say to set it up for folks before we do that?
It's very straightforward and clear. I think people will know everything and when they watch it.
Okay, excellent.
Thank you, Alex. I think we may not get to see you or hear you on screen again till the film is over, or beyond that. So thank you so much for, gearing up and getting to us via the waves. We feel close despite the lack of proximity.
Yes.
Totally. It's been a real pleasure getting to know you both.
All right, excellent.
Yeah.